Today's guest is Kris Austin. He is the leader of the People's Alliance Party of New Brunswick. And if you're curious about their color chart, they're the purple ones on your dial. Because we talk about red, blue, and orange, and green, and now we have purple. Welcome to the show.
Great to be here. Thank you, Dennis.
And thanks for taking the time. It's a cold, rainy spring day.
Yeah, it seems to be just about average at this time of year. Yeah.
So maybe to start us off right away, is you had a piece in a newspaper recently about double taxation.
Yes.
You want to, instead of reading it, you want to walk us through what inspired you to write it and what's the key points you wanted out of that?
Yeah, I guess it was probably about a year and a half ago where it came to my attention that New Brunswick actually has what is commonly known here as a double tax. And when I heard that, it kind of spurred my interest. Like, what a double tax? What does that mean? Mm-hmm. And essentially, what it is, it's an additional provincial tax on properties that are non-owner occupied, as well as business properties. So anyone that owns a second home or a cottage is paying the double tax. Landlords that operate apartments or apartment buildings, they're paying a double tax. Well, actually, they're not paying it. They're passing it on to the tenants, which increases the rental rates for tenants. So tenants are paying the double tax. And then small businesses. When you have, whether it's, kind of a small convenience store or any type of small business that you have a property that you run your business out of, they're charged a double tax.
Is the assumption that those properties generate revenue, therefore have a greater capacity to pay a different tax compared to your principal residence?
Yeah, and I mean, we've heard that argument, but frankly, it doesn't hold weight for us, simply because New Brunswick is the only province in Canada that charges this double tax. Okay. So we are truly unique in that situation. And the fact, when you take away, any margin of profit for business, well, what's the point of being in business, right? Yeah. You do it to make a living and to hire people and to have a functioning operation. But when you're taxed the way we are in New Brunswick, especially with the double tax, you're left with very little margin of profit. And that's why so much investment is being diverted away from New Brunswick, and why we don't see economic growth here because of the high taxes.
I want to see it because I'm slow on some of this stuff. So the notion of double tax makes it sound like it's taxed twice. Mm-hmm. So I think of two transactions. Mm-hmm. Is it that double tax is double the amount?
Yeah, yes. I mean, that's more of an accurate perception of it. I mean, in New Brunswick, you have municipal taxes, which your municipality will put a tax on the property, which is what every province in Canada does. Yep. But in New Brunswick, what makes it unique is the province of New Brunswick then adds an additional tax on top of it, which is approximately double of what the municipal taxes are in most regions, jurisdictions around the province.
Double taxation isn't necessarily two transactions, it's one amount on top, or a larger amount.
Yeah, it's pretty much double what your municipal tax rate is. That's why they coined the phrase double tax. Yeah. And here on May the 12th and 13th, on the 13th we had guest speakers into our AGM at the Delta in Fredericton. Yeah. We had a great lineup of people. We had Vern Faulkner, a former journalist, Dr. Dharm Singh, who's the president of the New Brunswick Medical Society, and then we had Willie Schulten, who is a tax spokesperson for the New Brunswick Apartment Association. And he talked about the double tax, and when he was talking about it, he's been fighting that since 2004. Yeah. So here we are over 13 years later, and no progress, Yep. So it's very clear that the Liberal Conservative governments are not going to really change that. They want status quo, and we're just convinced, when you look at the economics of it, it's one of the driving factors of why we don't see growth economically in New Brunswick. I'm a firm believer high taxes do not lead to economic growth. It has a counter effect.
Okay. To play in that field of taxation a bit now, and then we'll leave it, but sometimes working with a specific topic, it gives the audience an opportunity to see where you're coming from, sure, at least on an issue, and you can get a feel for People's Alliance and the leader and where you're going and how you want to get there. Mm-hmm. So there's some clarity to the message and some chance for some depth.
Sure.
So it fascinates me with municipal taxes then, because the flip side of it is, well, where does the money go, or what's it pay for? Mm-hmm. And it's not a justification. I just want to add layers and depth. So not that long ago in Fredericton was a story about a private business owner, a King Street Ale House in Brewbakers.
Yes.
And, you know, they frame it up a certain way to create some tension
Sure.
about how much that person pays per week in property tax.
Mm-hmm.
And they didn't mention double taxation. They just got right into the volume.
Mm-hmm.
And the short of it would be, you know, for his operation, he pays something like $53,000 a year in property taxes.
Right.
But at the same time was a story 2 or 3 days later about the city's total assets and their value,
Mm-hmm.
and the division by household,
Mm-hmm.
which comes to $56,000 per year.
Mm-hmm.
So I wanted to go, well, Mr. Williams, like you're $3,000 to the good for what you're paying for what you get, because of sidewalks and roads and infrastructure that bring people to your facility.
Mm-hmm.
So that allows you to be in business, because all that infrastructure and support allows you to be in business to have that. It seems to be lost in the whole conversation is what's the balance between the parts?
Well, and
So because you can't run a business unless there's community, and you can't have community unless there's some shared assets.
sure. I think I think any reasonable, rational person would say, you know, nobody has an issue with paying taxes per se, right?
Yeah?
I mean, well, look, nobody likes taxes, but we understand that in a functioning society, if you're going to have government services, you have to pay taxes. That's just a no-brainer.
I wanted to do that because those in the audience would be going, what?
Yeah. What's he saying? Yeah.
That's one of the narratives that needs to change.
Sure.
Is that there's a reason why we pay taxes, and we've forgotten what that reason is.
But the reason why we've forgotten the main reason we pay taxes is because so much of it's wasted on you know, frivolous spending and re-election promises that people have lost faith in the taxes that they're paying and how it's managed. I mean, look, just recently the government came out allocating $9 million to TD Bank. Now TD Bank, and you get a load of this, TD Bank, their first quarter recorded a profit of over $2 billion. I mean, they're a multi-billion-dollar profitable organization. They're a bank, for crying out loud.
Yeah.
Why are we as taxpayers giving money to a multi-billion-dollar corporation to create a call center job? And this is what infuriates me. We gave over $8 million to Sears Canada, which is
good.
You know, on the verge of bankruptcy, to create a call center job in Edmonton and St. John. So this is what erodes the trust of taxpayers. People want their tax dollars to go to good roads. They want their tax dollars to go to education, healthcare, and your social programs. When your tax dollars, $300 million of it every year is going to corporate interests in the hopes to create jobs, that's where you lose people.
Yep. Fascinating. And so are you differentiating then the role that politics plays, or the buddy system, to give it a gentle name, plays, compared to there is a reason for taxes. It does create this infrastructure and support that allows us to share community and share province. I just wonder what the scale is. Like, is 99% of it okay, and it's that 1% that draws all the attention in the media all the time, like Atcon and Sears and TD Bank? Do you think we're pretty much in okay shape? And we got to fix the edges, or the whole thing's askew?
No, I think the whole thing's askew. I really do, because I think if you look at the budget, the provincial budget on a regular basis, we bring in over $8 billion. And really, I mean, $8 billion is not a lot of money in terms of government, but New Brunswick has a population of about 50,000 people. So $8 billion is really the revenue for what most places around the world would consider a small city or a medium-sized city. So we're trying to operate a medium-sized city with a geographical land base like New Brunswick with over $8 billion. And I firmly believe we're mismanaging that in so many ways. First of all, we're giving over $300 million a year in corporate welfare. That's either through loans, subsidies, forgivable loans, whatever it is, to business to try to create jobs.
And that's annually.
That's annually.
Yeah, and there might even be bigger than that.
And some years it may be, that's right. And I think when you look at that, and what really bothers me, Dennis, about it is if government did an analysis over the last 2 decades of all the money they've given out to corporations to create jobs, and they did an actual fact-based, data-proof
business case.
You know what I'm saying? To say, okay, here's how much we gave out, here's the projected jobs we hoped for, but here's the jobs that were actually created. I think you would see a massive gap between the money given out and the job creation that we've seen. Nova Scotia did it. They did just what I said. They did a research on their corporate welfare system, and they found that less than half of the promoted or claimed jobs actually came to fruition. So a lot of money's wasted with very little results.
You could even add another variable in there, which would be time. You know, did those hundreds of thousands or millions of dollars, did the jobs last 1 year, 2 years, 3 years, right? Is that transient nature of some work?
Yep.
That would tie nicely into conversations with how do we retain young people in the province.
Right.
Separate from, you know, whenever that comes up, I always go, yeah, but young people like to go. So Ontario's got the same problem as New Brunswick does, Quebec does. Young people need to go, but it's about creating that fun place to live, and then they come back. And
Yeah.
So the, you know, will we ever get to the time when there's a financial strategy and a government subsidy strategy that looks at 20 years or 30 years instead of 3 or 4 years?
Well, I think that's the fundamental problem, specifically in New Brunswick, but I think in a broader sense in terms of democracy. Democracy is a great system, but it has its flaws. And I think in the flaws is the fact that we elect people every 4 years. So for a lot of politicians' minds, when they're in power, it's how do I stay elected or get reelected in 4 years? Well, you can look at now at what the Premier's doing. I mean, the Liberals are going all over the province, making all these announcements, spending money like we've got it, you know, falling from the sky. And it's all in the sense that there's an election coming up. Now look, I'll be the first to say money needs to be put into roads. I firmly believe in that. But where money doesn't need to be put into is twinning highways like we see that they're doing in Bucktouche and Shediac. I mean, of all the places in New Brunswick to twin a highway, you choose to do it in Bucktouche and Shediac, between Bucktouche and Shediac, at a cost of $142 million that they're paying to put a 4-lane highway in, you know, in a remote area of the province. It's baffling to me.
So do you have a sense of what your priorities would be?
Our priority is twofold. On one hand, we want to cut waste and mismanagement. We want to end corporate welfare, and duality is another one we feel is a huge waste in terms of how services are offered in New Brunswick. We fully support the rights of both linguistic communities, French and English, but we want to see more of a streamlined approach rather than these two silos that we're holding up. Healthcare is a perfect example. If you look at cost per patient in New Brunswick, there's a higher cost per patient with Vitalite than there is with Horizon Health Services. And if we were to take Horizon and Vitalite and merge them into one bilingual health authority, we could save $40 to $60 million every single year without closing any hospitals or laying off any nurses or doctors. So we want to end duality. Busing's the same thing.
Okay, yeah, but go.
With school buses, why we have, you know, the English children on one bus and the French children on another bus, to me is ridiculous. It's a waste of money, and it's in my opinion, it's a form of segregation here in this country. So we will end that. We will make sure where feasible, it may not work everywhere, but where it's feasible, that the English and French kids travel on the same bus. You save money, and we feel that it gives a better chance for the two cultures to come together.
Okay, so let's wander into that a little bit, if you would. And it's not to be confrontational, it's about adding some depth and layers. I mean, normal media or traditional media will get into the conflict. No, I just want to ask a tough question.
Yeah, absolutely.
But I want it to get a bit deeper.
Yep.
So an interview with Jean-Marie Nadeau, well-known Acadian activist.
Yep.
You know, Jean-Marie was great. And we got into talking about the busing thing. And of course he brings his Acadian point of view of constitutional rights, sustain the two languages. From the francophones that I've spoken to, the fear or the constant risk of assimilation, it can start as soon as you get on the bus when you go to school, for some of them, what they believe. What struck me, was lost in that whole discussion, was if we broaden the lens and pull back a little bit. There was a story in the media around the same time that here's the busing cost in New Brunswick, which I remember roughly as $560 a student. And that's maintaining the two-bus system. The cost in Nova Scotia was $932 per student. So lost in this whole English-French debate or busing debate or duality debate was the fact that we're, you know, much more efficient cost per student-wise than, now I don't know what the reasons for that were.
Right.
But I'm thinking, but we're doing something pretty good here while sustaining the duality. And that got lost in the conversation.
Yeah.
Do you have some wiggle room for that as opposed to that efficiency of squeezing the duality? Because a side note to that is to sustain certain services, if you divide by population, then you're going to have skewed outcomes because some services, doesn't matter if 100 people use that school or 1,000 people use that school, that school needs to be there for that school.
Sure.
Or for that community, I mean. So there's some infrastructure costs that are fixed no matter the population that uses it.
Right. Right. What I want to see is I want to see in New Brunswick where it doesn't matter what language you speak, it doesn't matter what culture you have or what your background is, that you get the same service under the same government departments. And what we're not seeing in New Brunswick, and I agree with you that with those numbers with Nova Scotia and New Brunswick, but my counter argument to that would be, okay, well, New Brunswick busing is significantly lower, but how could we make it even lower and yet not lose the service of the busing for transportation for the children? To me, it's more than a financial thing when we talk about ending duality. It's more of an area where we have to stop segmenting,
Segregating.
yeah, I mean something along those lines of division. You know, we've got this culture over here, and let's look at it. And how do we find ways to bring it together? And you know, as a party, we support bilingualism. We support the fact that you know the French people and the English people you know have a right to their language of choice in government services. We have no issue with that. We support it. But what we're seeing today is so lopsided. Whether it's school buses, whether it's the health authorities, whether it's the language commissioner,
So it's out of balance.
it's way out of balance. Why should anybody lose their job because of language? Why should anybody in the civil service not be able to move up or have seniority just because of language? Why? I mean, Dennis, in Edmundston, they launched a pilot project for advanced care paramedics, or they were going to. And when they put out the proposals for people to step forward, you know what I mean? They didn't have enough bilingual paramedics to take it. Well, you know, I agree you'd like to have some bilingual paramedics in that area, obviously, to service because there's a large francophone population. But is it smart to completely cancel the program because you don't have enough bilingual paramedics? That's where we have the issue. That's where common sense has got to be applied to say, look, we tried for the bilingual and we'll continue to strive for that. But if we don't hit it, we're not going to cancel it because it's an important program.
And maybe there's plan B and plan C, like a language training program for those that do go through the gate but don't have the second language.
Sure.
You know.
And you got to keep in mind too, there's translation lines in every paramedic, every ambulance. Every ambulance has a dedicated translation line. We're not living in 1962 anymore. This is 2017. There's technology that can translate. There's other avenues that we can use to make it work.
Which ties to a culture shift. So in some ways, New Brunswick's a wonderful, fascinating, awesome place. You know, it's a great place to be home. But when we try to instill an energy for change, which is got to be where you're coming from, because you're trying to get people to vote for something that they've never done before, and so that's an interesting thing to offer, especially now. When interviewing John McGarry on healthcare delivery, there's a section there that he spoke of with much passion about New Brunswick's perfectly designed for regional healthcare delivery model.
Right.
So it's perfect for it, he said, and it will drop. There's an efficiency of scale. There's an increase in performance for reach, you know, or for people getting the services they need on a more timely way. Like he could see it, but our culture is stuck in that every community wants a hospital.
Yeah.
It's a 1960s mindset, and when you said that we're not in the 60s anymore, I thought, yeah, you sound like John McGarry.
Right.
So how do we help nurse that along, that we're living here now, and it goes this cadence now?
I think because people, I think what people are afraid of, I live in a rural area, a small town, I should say. Minto's is a small town, and there's lots of small towns in New Brunswick. Brunswick's mostly made up of small towns and rural areas. So I think voters and residents of those areas feel like, you know, they don't want to lose the services that they're receiving. Especially based on the taxes that they're paying, right? They want to make sure that they hang on to that.
And you know, a hospital is an anchor in a town, like a school is an anchor in a town.
100%. Now, if there's a better way to do that without diminishing those services, and that's the key. You know, it's one thing to say, well, look, let's get rid of some of these hospitals in rural areas. But my question is, well, what are you going to replace it with? How are you going to maintain the quality of service in these areas, especially for seniors? You know, if a senior's got to drive an hour and a half to go get blood work, and they've got to get it 3 or 4 times a week, that's a huge burden on that individual.
To play with that a little bit, though, and it's good points, you know. if you're living in a bigger province, we're not, but if you were living in a bigger province, the expectation's different.
Yeah.
You know, to get across Toronto or get across Montreal, there's your hour and a half.
Yeah.
You know, so the burden, yes, there's no question it's a burden for those people, but it's a shift in perception too, that maybe for the sake of economies of scale, because of the small population but a certain size budget, somewhere in there something needs to shift or change, which means we're going to have to let go.
Right.
Probably in several directions at the same time. We thought we were this way, but actually maybe now we need to be this way.
Right.
Politics sits at that intersection of helping facilitate that. And you guys represent a new way or a new approach or a new choice.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think, you know, one thing we've pushed for as well is more funding and support for home care workers. It's really, it's ridiculous what home care support workers getting paid in New Brunswick. I mean, it's around $12 an hour. Nova Scotia, I think it's $17, $18 an hour, and everywhere else it's around $17, $18 an hour. So if we increase funding for that program so that special care workers could go into homes and also have extramural nurses, you know, better supported and more of those out there, then you may be able to make that slow transition, you know, in that sense. But you've got to have a backup plan. You can't.
Well, you can't take something away without saying what you're going to replace it with.
That's right,
So
and
it gets in the messaging.
exactly, and it's got to, you got to keep the level of service there to make sure that you know, people are looked after, because again, we all pay taxes, and the taxes have got to reflect the service that you're receiving, and if it doesn't, then, you know, as a taxpayer, you should be upset about that.
Can we riff a bit with the taxes? A general theme, and I can show newspaper clippings going back to the 80s. One of the constant narratives in this province is we have to have a competitive corporate tax rate. But anytime I go in and check on StatsCan or anywhere else, like outside our narrative and somebody else, we're right in the thick of it. Right now we're at 12% roughly. And we're kind of the same as everybody else.
Right.
And yet we still see no economic gain, like your story about all the money that we give in corporate welfare, your phrase, and you still don't see the job gains. Our median income stay the same, our jobless rate stays the same. So after 30 years of that way of thinking, is that the right way to go to try to create the change that we think we're doing? Would corporate tax rate become a topic in the next election, and we need to be more competitive and drop it down to 11 or 10%, and all these jobs will magically appear? But it's been shown over 30 years that it makes no difference.
Yeah, and I think when you talk about, just from a political level, when you talk about lowering corporations' taxes, you're not going to win many people over on that, and rightfully so, because what our plan is, and what the way we think is that, look, we've got to stop putting all of our eggs in the big corporate basket, whereas if we can get one industry or one mill or one big thing to come here and create 500 or 600 jobs, and that's what we got to do, that doesn't work. What we've said is, let's shift focus and let's say, okay, instead of focusing, and don't get me wrong, we want corporate industry here, and we want to open the doors and do what we can to get them here. But the focus in our mind should be towards small and medium-sized business. Because if you look at the statistics and the data, it's the small and medium-sized business that is the economic backbone of New Brunswick. So we've called even for an elimination of the small business tax. And it's low now. It's around, I think, 2.5%. But by eliminating it completely, you're giving the extra profit to the small business owner that can potentially invest in their business to grow the economy. And I think you're sending a message to the rest of Canada. You're saying this is a place that is business friendly. We don't charge a business tax, small business tax, so come here. Think about it, Dennis, how many people, young people, you mentioned earlier, that are going to Alberta, Saskatchewan, Newfoundland, or wherever else to work. How many of those people would come back to New Brunswick if New Brunswick was a viable business option to have a successful business that would come back? If the double tax was eliminated where they could make a profit, if the small business tax was eliminated, that they can actually get that business off the ground. So all the money, the $300 million you're spending on corporate welfare, take a fraction of that, eliminate the small business tax, get rid of the double tax, and I believe your economic boom will happen once you create that business environment.
So that would be the climate that government is responsible for creating a great place for people to come do business in.
Absolutely.
One of the narratives that it's misleading to my way of thinking is when mainstream media tend to talk about the government's, and politicians do it too, is they're going to create jobs. I'm thinking, no, Because if the government technically were creating jobs, then they're adding to the civil service,
Right.
because that's your domain for creating jobs. You're really trying to create a milieu or an environment that allows that to kind of percolate.
Yeah.
Did you have any specific examples of sectors that might be those kind of small and medium-sized businesses? Is it just the IT? Because IT gets a fair amount of ink, a fair amount of attention.
Right.
But there's more than just IT. Or should we focus on 2 or 3 things and do them really well? You want to play with that?
I think we should let the free market do its thing. And I agree with you 100%. This idea that government is out to create jobs is a myth. The only government jobs are government jobs. You know what I mean? The civil service. So, but it is the government's role to make sure that the environment is healthy and productive, so that jobs can create through the free market system. And when I talk about eliminating the small business tax and the double tax and these sorts of initiatives, it's our belief that by doing that, you're going to create that environment. You're going to create a place where people will, and it doesn't matter what they do, whether it's in retail or forestry or whatever industry they want to, or commercial project they want to get into. If you leave it open, I believe the free market will find its course in a friendly business environment.
I want to wander into free market stuff, but no, we'll leave that for now for another day. It's like the free market, that went away like the 80s. The corporations dominate so much stuff. There's no sense of competition. But in that framework, though, underneath it, that window of smaller, lighter, faster companies, there's a window there maybe for a small place like New Brunswick, because we don't need a lot to make a big change.
That's it.
If we can get our head around what does that look like, which is where political leadership comes in.
Right.
Somewhere in that talk about small and medium-sized business, the idea of food. So does that cross your party's path and your path about, farming is a business.
Right.
And it's a small and medium-sized business.
Right.
We no longer have the ability to feed ourselves.
Right.
We rely on a 90% of it from outside sources. Is there a window there in the next 20 or 30 years to create a sustainable farming culture as an agropreneur sort of mindset?
Absolutely. I think if the political will is there, it's certainly the option is right in front of us. It's baffling to me, and I understand the whole globalization thing, and you buy something from China for a lot less than you would whatever for you made here. But when you talk about food,
see, you changed right away. You talked about it's something different about it.
Well, it is, because I believe that for a province like New Brunswick, with all of the rural areas that we have and the farmland and the healthy soil and everything that goes with it, I mean, we got a real opportunity here to have the whole local, homegrown, healthy, food right here at home. So yes, I 100% think that and I'm no expert in agriculture, I'll be the first to admit it, but I've talked to people in agriculture, and I understand where they're coming from, and I understand the potential that is there for the province of New Brunswick to really capitalize on that. And I think when you see like privatization of like food services in the hospitals to Sodexo, where now you've got a France-based company that's shipping freezer food to New Brunswick to feed patients. What is wrong with us? Like why on earth can we not grow that food or farm that food right here and use it to our hospitals? But it's got to take some different thinking.
Yes. Previous interview was Donna Thériault and Edouard Alain from CDC, which is the social enterprise program at École Sainte-Anne in Fredericton.
Yes.
Where they buy local and they employ 30 people. It's cooked right in the cafeteria at the school.
Fantastic.
And it's very much through the Francophone community down in the southeast,
right?
As they shared during the interview. They've got a binder that's this thick. This is how you do it, guys. There's the template, right? It's now getting more awareness, and there's the issue of scale. You need a few institutions like hospitals or schools or senior care facilities.
Right.
And then that works its way back to the farmer in the supply chain, because they plant 4 acres of carrots instead of 2 rows of carrots, and that kind of. But the intervening tipping point would be political. All these pieces hover so close together, but if there was political will to go, New Brunswick's identity was built a long time ago on forestry, fishing, and farming.
Right.
We still talk about forestry and fishing, and the third F has disappeared.
Yeah. No, I agree, and it does. It's going to take political initiative to say, look, here's a different course that we can chart, and to make it work. Because I know for myself, even as a consumer, I much prefer to buy from the local farmer. I mean, whether it's eggs or, you know, your vegetables or whatever, even your beef.
Yeah.
There's something about that local touch that it adds quality to the food. And, you know, I think government could do better. And, you know, whether we talk about subsidizing some of that food as a government to lower the prices so that's more fiscally competitive. But the opportunity, I think, is definitely there.
Yeah, or to even become a buyer, you know,
Yeah.
put it on their list of things. So that gets into contracts, which gets into
Yep.
what's going on in some of the hospital services right now
Exactly.
with their food supply. Lovely quote from Amanda Wildman from the National Farmers Union in New Brunswick, saying that if New Brunswickers redirected $13 a week, not add more $13, just redirected $13 a week from their grocery bill to buying local, it would have an cumulative impact of $100 million for farmers in New Brunswick.
Wild, eh?
Yeah. So we have it. You know, we have everything we need. We just need these little shifts,
Right.
which gets to politics. Totally different topic, but it kind of connects. So People's Alliance Party, sort of new kid on the block, but you're now, what, 9 years old?
Will be 8 years next June.
Yeah.
Is when we were founded, June of 2010.
And you've said recently there's been a good upswing in registrations or attention or
Yeah.
so can you speak a bit so people can become more intimate? And I'm addressing a frustration. For me, watching how media cover politics or political elections, they call it like it's a sports event.
Yeah.
And before the election day, they allocate certain amount of space to each of the parties,
Right.
and it's not equal.
Right. Yeah.
It's not here's 100% of the space, and there's so everybody gets 20% because there's 5 of you.
Yeah.
No, you guys got this percentage of the vote, so we're going to give you this much space,
Yeah.
which perpetuates a real breakdown in the conversation necessary
Yeah.
to have a healthy democracy.
And-
So here you have the space to go, like, let it rip. Like, who are you guys, and where you're trying to take us?
Well, and again, the whole premise of our party is to be a common sense vehicle for governance. And when I talk about common sense, I talk about, you know, again, things like taxation reform and reasonable taxation reform. You know, we believe industry as a whole should be paying more in taxes. They're not paying enough. Matter of fact, if you look at the recent property tax assessments, well, not everybody's, but a lot of people's went up. Most unfairly went up. But then you can look at Canaport LNG in St. John, theirs dropped by 67%. So you can look at industry as a whole, and frankly, they're not paying enough taxes, in our opinion. So we want to see tax reform, because when industry or one sector is not paying enough taxes, that burden's put on somebody else, and it's always the people. So we're left paying a bigger tax burden because this sector over here isn't. So we want a more balanced and fair approach of taxation.
So one of your guiding principles would be that. More
Yes.
balanced and fair, and you kind of give an example of where it might apply. But do you have a methodology for how to make that work?
Well, I think you just change the tax code. I think you've got to change the way assessments are done. We want to see the province get out of tax assessments. We want to see it given to the municipalities so it's more localized. There'd be more accountability on a local level. But beyond taxes, like as a party, the very center of our party when we formed was built around the whole potential sale of MB Power. And what we saw in that was not so much, I mean, it was the issue of the sale of MB Power, but it was the way it was brought out. You know what I mean? Like it was very, you know, cloak and dagger, behind the scenes, kind of in the shadows. And then, you've got MLAs in the government that oppose this deal, but are muzzled to speak out about it.
Yep.
And it doesn't matter if it's liberal or conservative. What New Brunswickers don't have today in government is representation. What we do every 4 years, we elect a party, and the leader of that party, basically, and the caucus, determines the course of the province. So we're left without a voice for 4 years. If you think your MLA is representing you, think again. They're representing the party by which they stand for. So we want to do it differently in the sense that the People's Alliance will offer a free vote for our MLAs. So when our MLAs go to the legislature, they're going to represent their constituents first and the People's Alliance second. And that's a stronger form of democracy. It's a more accurate form of representation for the people. If we don't feel confident as voters that when we elect John Smith or Susan Smith, you know, to be our MLA, that person's going to really reflect our wishes locally, then we've lost a little slice of that representation in democracy.
Playing with what happened in BC recently. BC provincial elections, it's a minority government with the Green Party getting 3 seats for the first time. And in a funny way, media will describe it as holding the balance of power, but it's more like they're a leverage point. I don't know if they're a balance of power, but it invites a three-way conversation. So it'll invite those parties to figure out how to work together.
Right.
Nationally, some of Canada's best policy happened when there was minority governments.
For sure.
New Brunswick has never really, we've kind of had it, but it's not really a minority government in the sense it's a tighter split between the two.
Right.
Rather than there's 3 voices or 4 voices in the legislature. What's your answer to the question about, well, you're going to split the vote, or you can't be functional if you've got a minority government?
Right. Well, there's 2 things to that. First of all, people will say to us, and it's usually, not always, but it's usually the staunch party supporters of the Liberals or Conservatives. Mostly the Conservatives say, you're going to split the vote. First of all, in order to split a vote, it means that someone's entitled to that vote. And that's where I fundamentally disagree. Why the Conservative Party of New Brunswick thinks they're entitled to people's votes, or the Liberal Party of New Brunswick feels entitled to the vote, is just absolute nonsense. And it's my vote. Everybody has their own vote, and they should look at the policies and the platforms. They should look at the histories of the parties and how they've governed and vote accordingly. So this split vote nonsense is just what it is. It's nonsense. It's propaganda to try to squeeze out the other voices. So I know how that game's played. On the flip side, in terms of minority government, I firmly believe minority governments sometimes make the best government, because what it does, it creates a negotiating power within the legislature. So if you've got 3 or 4 parties in there, now you have to negotiate, with budgets being passed. You have to negotiate certain bills that go forward if you want them to be passed. And British Columbia is a great case in point, because there you have simply 3 seats in the middle that now really have some massive power in what happens in that province. New Brunswick would be incredibly fortunate to have the same scenario here.
So that should unfold as part of your party strategy, because you can already anticipate the storylines from the different parties. And somewhere in there is so some peace with the notion of a minority government is actually quite progressive. And having several voices in the legislature is also quite progressive. Then there's the notion that 40% of the people don't bother to vote.
Right.
So do you have some thoughts on how to attain the minority government structure in New Brunswick through getting the 40% of the people who don't bother to vote to actually engage in the process again?
Our strategy is really a 2-pronged strategy. One hand, we want to engage people that do vote, but have party loyalties, that in the past, whether they've always voted blue or they've always voted red, we want to engage them and say, is this party loyalty really working for you? We have an unemployment rate hovers around 10%.
Is it working for you?
Is it working for you? Look at the healthcare system. Look at just look anywhere. New Brunswick is in a real precarious situation because of bad governments. So I appeal to those people. Like look outside the box, and that's working. We've got all kinds of past Liberal supporters and Conservative supporters that have come our way because they're just simply fed up, and they can no longer tell the difference between what the Liberal Party of New Brunswick stands for and what the Progressive Conservative Party stands for. They're so intertwined now in how they govern, there's no difference. So they've lost faith in the 2 parties, and that's where we're gaining a lot of support. The other prong is what you said, is to reach out to those people that don't vote at all. And believe it or not, that seems to be the greater challenge, because those people are saying, well, what's the point of voting? You're all the same, or nothing's going to change. And so it's to help them understand that the reason why nothing changes is because we've stuck with the same old 2 for so long. But if you do want change, you've got to look outside the box and look for that change that you want. And, people don't understand that, when you work, your income tax comes out, your elected officials determine where that income tax goes. Whether it's your roads, your healthcare, your infrastructure, whatever it is, government is in your life every day. It is. Yeah. So the fact that you don't vote, to me, means you're not fully understanding the impact of that. And so I'm hoping, I'm optimistic that that changes with that group of people as well, that they do say, well, now maybe we have something worth voting for in their mind that they could support. But I think, again, we're taking the two-prong approach to make sure we reach out to as many people as possible.
So let's assume there's a chance for New Brunswick to have a minority government. Let's assume there's 5 colors sitting in the ledge, 5 different political parties. To get there, the red team and the blue team have lots of identity and lots of history. The orange team has a little bit of that identity with the New Democrats, but it's taken a bit of a pounding the past 10, 15 years or so. Then along comes the success that Mr. Kuhn had and the Green Party had, and then, you know, 9 years, 8 years is a long time. So you're not the new kid on the block anymore. You're a legitimate choice for people to have.
Right.
How do you differentiate yourself from the way most people will see, well, there's really 2 parties and then there's these other 3 entities over here? Can you give us some depth to the difference between yourselves, the Green Party, and the New Democrat Party?
Yeah. Well, I think a lot of it is our message, you know, and the fact that we're not afraid to tackle tough issues. And I know that's a political cliche. A lot of politicians, you know what I mean? But we prove it because, again, look, I'm not naive. I know when you talk about the language issue in New Brunswick, there's some that's going to, you know, try to paint you a certain way, and I get that. We counted that cost.
Yeah, have you guys been framed a little bit as the Anglo Party, or is any of that come to bite you at all?
Well, I mean, yeah, I mean, we hear it, but a lot of times when we hear it, it's from, again, those entrenched parties that use that as propaganda to try to tear us down. But we just, listen, if we can't have a reasonable, rational debate around any issue in New Brunswick, then we have a serious problem with the system. And I use the example of, you know, the MLAs Sherry Wilson and Glenn Tate, who a few years ago had simply asked, what is the cost to taxpayers of duality in the province of New Brunswick? Well, I mean, the place just about exploded. You know, they were forced to apologize for even asking the question. And to me, that's where you've got to break down in the system. If a simple question on where tax dollars are spent can't be answered and answered in a reasonable, rational way, then the system has truly broken down. So what differentiates us as a party, to get back to the point, is that we will tackle tough issues. We will think outside the box where I don't see the other parties doing that. Another one we come out with was changes to the Motor Vehicle Act. And I've asked the question to many people. Do you ever stop and wonder why every year you have to register the same vehicle back in your name every year? I mean, why do we do that? Has the government forgotten that you own that vehicle from the previous year? I mean, do they not keep the data on the registration? So we've said, frankly, and I think most people agree, it's nothing more than a money grab. It's a way to collect revenue for the government. And I disagree with that. I think if you need to collect money from the government, or for the government, then you simply, you do what they did and they raise taxes. You don't do it through this backhanded approach. So we've said, look, let's end annual vehicle registrations. You do it once, and then if you sell the vehicle, then the new owner would register the vehicle once. And as long as you own that vehicle, you never have to register it again. So that issue, language issues, taxes, different things that we're talking about are things that you won't hear the other parties talk about. And the only time you'll hear the other parties talk about it is when we've brought it to the forefront first. And then they're trying to play catch up. And I've seen the other parties kind of, scurry around that as well. Yep.
So all of those things you mentioned are program kind of driven or policy kind of driven. Any philosophical differences? Conservatives will say, well, we believe in smaller government and less taxation, generalizing. Liberals will talk about being progressive. It's all blended the same nowadays. I'm not clear anymore on what the New Democrat message used to be about process, social democratic process, and then from that process will come your strategies and your policies. Green Party, in some ways, it looks a lot like the New Democrats were about 30 years ago in terms of the principles and policies or philosophy behind it. But they can't get past how media keep portraying them as an environmental party. And then there's you in the mix. So I thought, I've asked that of conservatives. Liberals haven't come on the show yet. I'm hoping that'll come at some point.
Sure.
Same kind of question. So the philosophical underpinning root that Is it in response to what you see is missing in the landscape, and so you're trying to fill a gap? Or is there a strong underlying principle that guides the whole organization?
Yeah, I think if you were to talk about, I guess to simplify the party, which is kind of hard to do because there are so many issues, to just say, well, that's this one thing. But I think it gets back to what I was saying earlier, more about representation. We do not have political representation or government representation anymore as people, right? As citizens and residents. What we have is better than a democracy, what I would term as more of a partyocracy, where you vote a party in and that party governs. And if you look at the numbers, even with our electoral system, the Liberals now are governing with a majority. But I think if you look at the raw data, it was something like only 32% of the registered voters actually put them in power. So 32% of the New Brunswick population holds 100% of the power in New Brunswick.
Yeah. Fair Vote Canada does that federally all the time.
Yeah.
They've got a great funny clip on there with one of the Air Force people doing a drooping democracy.
Right,
It's pretty cool.
So we believe that, the governments have got to get back to real representation and saying, you know what, the MLA's first responsibility is to the people that elected that MLA, not to the party.
Here's a thought. A friend once threw this idea at me 2 years ago that New Brunswick's constitutionally organized, and I couldn't verify it, so I'm just, that we're actually independents. So the notion of having to be part of a political party in order to become an elected official is not necessarily in our original structure.
No.
That we could all be independents. You could have 55 independents sitting in the legislature.
Absolutely.
And then they got to figure out how to work together.
Yeah, that's it.
And that really appealed to him because of the fatigue with the political party process and how people who aren't elected are actually influencing the majority of the decisions that affect the province.
Exactly. And that's true. And, I think that is the thing that I think people do have to understand, and it gets back to this sense of entitlement. There's no law or any policy that says these two parties are the ones to govern, and that's where our shift has got to change as a province and as the people in how we vote. I find it interesting and frustrating at times. But when I look at the makeup of our elections and the results of those elections, I can't help but just scratch my head and say, people complain all the time, and rightfully so. I understand the frustration. I feel it myself. But yet at the same time, get behind that secret ballot box and continue on with the same methodology that they've done for years.
It's fascinating.
It is fascinating.
Because that's why I like using the phrase letting go. What is it that New Brunswick needs to let go of? And then we can pick a topic. Because it's prevalent in so many different themes and topic areas. And politics is, in a way, the most fascinating because it's the intersection of all those things. When you talked about it's in your life every day, people need to understand that.
And I don't think they have grasped that. A lot of people, especially people that don't vote, they haven't grasped that idea that, there's a small portion of the population that is electing a government, oftentimes, more often than not, a majority government that has 100% control over all the laws, over all the policies, over all the taxation, social programs, government services. They control it. So you're by not voting, you're just allowing them to do it for you.
Can we slide to you a little bit? So what made you get into this? Were you so frustrated and pulling your hair out? And it's like, I am tired of yelling at the TV about this. I'm playing a bit, but there is some juice to wanting to make a difference and make things better as you see it better.
Yeah, and that kind of goes back. I was in ministry for about 10 years, and when I went into ministry, I went in it to make things better, to make people's lives better, and spiritual things and all of that goes with it. And when I saw that door kind of, when you start to lose the passion for one thing, then you look to where else can that passion be directed towards, and it turned out to be politics. And in 2008, I ran for the Progressive Conservative nomination for Grand Lake Gagetown, and I lost that nomination, which,
Was it a fair process then? Because right now there's some buzz going on in another constituency about that.
There is. And I can tell you, now mind you, this was 10 years ago, to be fair. But I seen some of the kind of the little things that were done kind of behind the scenes to try to, you know, pick the one they wanted to win. And I see that so often in the two parties where, you know, they'll manipulate ever so carefully, whether it's not putting out the information that the nomination's going to close, or where they hold the nomination, or who can vote at the nomination. All these sorts of things, you know, they play with it. And I get frustrated, and I got frustrated over the process. But more importantly, I think what frustrated me was the fact that, okay, you know, we can just go on with the same game. You know, we elect the Liberal or Conservative, we run an election, we win or we lose, but nothing changes. So I said, you know, if I want change, what's the old saying? Be the change you want to be.
Or be the change you wish to see.
There you go. Thank you. So I said, you know what? You know, I can sit and talk about it, and I can complain about it, or I can do what I can do to try to make it different and to bring some fresh ideas to the forefront. And what I found is, starting out, a lot of it was my thinking and close people around me, you know, going over. But as we've gotten to where we are today, there's so many smart people that have come to the party to say, well, have you looked at this policy? Have you looked at the way this works? And why don't you do this? And so things that I've never thought of that other people are bringing to the table that we're saying, hey, that makes sense. Let's implement that as a policy. So it's so encouraging to see how it's blossomed to where it is today. And I really am optimistic to our chances next year during the election.
Social media is an interesting equalizer in lots of ways. Do you have a social media strategy yet? Because you're going to need to use alternative means of communication, because mainstream media is going to put it through the same formula.
Right.
So you got to get your message out, you got to have a certain reach and a different engagement level.
For sure. Yeah. Social media has been our #1 avenue or delivery vehicle for our message. And every month at our board meeting, we have a communications director, and he goes through the analytics of social media. How many people have responded to a post we've put on Facebook? How many have retweeted one of our tweets? You know, everything that goes with it. And month after month, we are at the top of the pack in terms of how we do social media, in terms of the political parties. So we're constantly utilizing that, because the good thing about social media is there's no filter, or there's no lens, you know what I mean? You just, if you want to get it's direct. You want to get a message out, that's the way to do it. It's unedited, here it is. And you can reach a huge amount of people through social media. So we have used that a lot, and we will continue to use it. But the demographic in New Brunswick too, you know, there is a demographic there that doesn't use social media. So we're also trying to find ways to reach them as well. Either, you know, like we've done a lot of town hall meetings where we've gone around the province to deliver our message. We've used newspapers to write commentaries and that sort of thing. So we're using every avenue we can, but social media by far is the most effective.
Cost effective too.
Absolutely.
When mainstream media covers politics, they always do budgets, especially during election time. So they'll talk about the Conservatives and their fundraising targets for the campaign.
Right.
Almost inferring, or the Liberals, you know, the rest, almost inferring that whoever raises the most money has the greatest chance of winning.
Right.
Which then, you know, pushes the 40% who don't vote. Like, well, like, what's the bother of voting if, you know, they've already raised $umpteen million and they're going to bomb us with ads, blah, blah, blah. Social media levels all of that. But are you able to share, or willing to share the financial side of things? Not necessarily like hard numbers, because it's going to take a while to get to where the other parties are. But are you to a spot where it's enough that you know that you're going to be in the game big time?
Right.
Come next election, you know, the fall of 2018. Yeah,
that is our primary focus right now, is finances, without question, because we feel like we're doing very well with our messaging. But where we need to improve is financial, and it's a challenge, because especially when you're not in the throes of an election, because people aren't really thinking politics. Yeah. So to engage them first, and then once you've engaged them, to ask them to donate and give, it has its challenges. But I will say, what's really encouraging for us is we've received more donations in the last year than probably we have in the last 6 combined. So we're seeing a great increase of donors coming forward. And I've always said to the team, I said, you know, we appreciate all donations. Anybody, whether they give $25 or $1,000 or more to the party, you know, this helps us drive our message home and deliver it. So finances is our key focus at this point, to be able to build the party, and like you said, to be a sizable force in the election.
Thinking of elections and kind of working today's conversation towards 18 months from now, but kind of working backwards from 18 months from now. One of the other narratives are, oh, why would I vote for you? You're never going to be in power.
Well, I think that goes back to the whole strategy of a potential minority government. And if you were to look right now, and if you were to say, well, if an election were called tomorrow, how would this play out? I think you would see that we are gaining a lot of steam, and I think you would see us with some seats in there at this point. And in a minority government, those few seats in the middle have a tremendous amount of power, a tremendous amount of negotiating ability to be able to get the things that we want to see into law and into policy in the province. So, our goal is always to form government. We want to get as many candidates as possible. We're shooting for government, but we also know that is a challenge. But if we gain a few seats, as a result of that push to form government, then it can have a tremendous amount of power and strength.
It's always been a curiosity to me when that question was posed as a challenge to any kind of newcomers, because you got to walk before you run.
Right.
So there's lots of merit to having 2 or 3 people in the legislature, and then having 8 or 10 people in the legislature.
Yeah.
That makes perfect sense to me, and yet the expectation from the voter was, well, you'll never be in power, so why should I vote for you?
Right.
Which infers in one of the other narratives that underplays all elections in New Brunswick so far, is that I vote for you, you get me a job. Yeah. I vote for you, you pave my road.
Yeah, that's
right? There's 2 distinct narratives, and I've heard that one ever since I moved here. It's like the purpose for voting in New Brunswick is to secure your personal financial situation.
Right. And that does have to shift. I mean, we got to look at the bigger picture here. I mean, how do we keep our hospitals going and we reduce wait times? How do we get our seniors out of hospitals and a dignified living in a seniors care home, as opposed to taking up a hospital bed where they don't want to be? And there's over 300 seniors right now living in hospitals.
And that was the discussion from the 2008-2009 window leading up to the 2011 election. So, well, we're almost 10 years later now.
Same problem.
Yeah.
Yep.
So do you have some thoughts about that culture of your vote isn't about getting you a job, your vote is about something bigger?
Well, yeah, and I think a lot of that has to do with just the disillusionment that comes with the 2 parties. Because I really do believe we're at a pivotal moment, and I think it's bigger than New Brunswick. I think you can look across the globe, and the whole shift of political thinking is happening. And some for the good, some maybe not, but we're seeing where jurisdictions around the world are saying, voters around the world are saying, we're tired of just this establishment it's like it's all come to a grinding halt in terms of representation, fair taxes, and all of that. You can look at France. They elected Macron there, who is a complete outsider. Of course, you can look to the United States. You can look to what happened in Europe with Brexit. On and on it goes. So we're seeing that kind of wave now coming to New Brunswick, where people who once were firmly loyal to the Liberal Party or firmly loyal to the Conservative Party are now really questioning, why am I loyal to this party and what's it doing for us as a whole? So they're starting to look outside the box, and we've been getting contacts from people that frankly I'm surprised. When I get that phone call from someone, I thought you were a strong Liberal, and they said, well, I was, but I'm just fed up.
Great. This is a great place for us to stop.
Yeah, sure.
So thank you for your time.
Great.
Really appreciate it.
Thank you, Dennis.
Great. And thank you for watching. As always, be good, have fun, and love each other.